In the interwar period, the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe was marked by the collapse of empires, shifting borders, and unresolved national aspirations. The Treaty of Versailles and subsequent settlements of 1919-1920 reshaped the region, but left many ethnic groups dissatisfied. For Ukrainians divided between Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Soviet Union, the absence of an independent state remained a source of frustration. In eastern Galicia, which was incorporated into the Second Polish Republic, a Ukrainian population of several million lived under Polish administration. Tensions emerged over land reforms, language policy, and representation in government. Polish authorities promoted assimilation, while Ukrainian nationalist groups sought autonomy or independence. Periodic unrest, arrests of political activists, and restrictions on cultural institutions created an atmosphere of repression and mistrust. By the 1930s, the rise of totalitarian regimes further complicated the situation. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, pursued expansionist goals in Central and Eastern Europe, while the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, consolidated its control through collectivization and political purges. Both powers viewed the territories of eastern Poland and western Ukraine as strategically important. The Nazi ideology of Lebensraum envisioned the region as part of future German settlement, while the Soviet Union sought to extend socialism and secure its western frontiers. For the local Ukrainian population, caught between these competing forces, the political future was uncertain. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 radically altered Galicia's position. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland was invaded from west and east, with Germany occupying the western part, and the Soviet Union annexing eastern Galicia into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Soviet rule brought rapid collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industry, and the integration of political life into Soviet structures. For some Ukrainians, this represented a fulfillment of the long-promised unity with Soviet Ukraine, but for others it meant repression, forced deportations, and the elimination of nationalist and religious leaders. Between 1939 and 1941, thousands were arrested, deported to Siberia, or executed in prisons. These events left deep scars and fueled resentment towards Soviet rule. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa brought another transformation. German forces advanced rapidly into Soviet-held territories, and Galicia came under Nazi occupation as part of the general government. The new administration imposed strict control, exploiting the region's resources and workforce for the German war effort. The Jewish population faced immediate persecution, leading to the destruction of centuries-old communities. Ukrainian nationalists, divided between factions of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, initially hoped that German occupation might open a path towards self-rule, but these expectations were soon disappointed. The German authorities rejected the idea of Ukrainian independence, instead using local collaborators for administrative purposes while suppressing nationalist aspirations. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning. The Red Army advanced westward, while German manpower shortages grew acute. The German High Command sought new recruits from occupied territories. Heinrich Himmler authorized the creation of foreign volunteer formations within the Waffen SS, presented as national divisions, but subordinated to German command. In Galicia, this took the form of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Galician. Recruitment began in the spring of 1943, promoted as an opportunity for Ukrainians to fight against the Soviet Union and defend their homeland from Bolshevism. German propaganda emphasized the shared struggle against communism, while local Ukrainian leaders, including representatives of the Ukrainian Central Committee, framed it as a means to gain military experience and international recognition for Ukrainian aspirations. The motivations for enlistment varied. Some volunteers were driven by anti-Soviet sentiment, especially those who had experienced repression during the Soviet occupation of 1939-1941. Others saw service as a means of survival, securing better rations and living conditions compared to the hardships under occupation. A number hoped it might eventually lead to the formation of a Ukrainian national army. Critics, however, condemned the recruitment as collaboration with Nazi Germany, pointing out that the division was formerly a unit of the Waffen SS, an organization already implicated in war crimes and ideological warfare. Despite these controversies, recruitment exceeded initial expectations. Around 8,000 men applied, though only about 13,000 were accepted after medical and political screening. The formation was officially established in April 1943 and trained in German-occupied Poland. The geopolitical context of the division's creation highlights the complexity of wartime choices in Eastern Europe. For Germany, the division was a tool to fill depleted ranks and extend control over the region. For many Ukrainians, it was seen, rightly or wrongly, as a chance to assert national presence within the constraints of occupation. For the Soviets, however, all such formations were labeled traitorous, and participants risked severe punishment if captured. This convergence of interests and contradictions set the stage for the division's deployment, its baptism of fire at Brody, and its controversial legacy in the decades that followed. The newly formed division underwent training in German-occupied Poland during the latter half of 1943 and into early 1944. Its official designation was the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Galician, though among Ukrainians it was commonly referred to simply as the Galician Division. The training took place in camps such as Hedelager near Dębica, where recruits were introduced to German military discipline, tactics, and ideology. Instructors included German officers and NCOs, while Ukrainian chaplains and community representatives attempted to frame the service as both a duty and an opportunity for national advancement. Training emphasized infantry tactics, anti-tank defense, and coordination with artillery, preparing the men for frontline service against the Red Army. The command structure reflected the division's dual nature. While the majority of rank-and-file soldiers were Ukrainian volunteers, the officer corps was dominated by Germans. The first commander was SS Brigade Führer Fritz Freitag, an experienced officer from the SS Totenkopf Division. Ukrainian liaison officers and chaplains provided a cultural and national presence within the unit, but strategic decisions remained firmly in German hands. This imbalance became a source of tension. While Ukrainian leaders promoted the division as a potential nucleus of a future national army, the Germans considered it strictly a Waffen-SS formation loyal to Berlin. By early 1944, the division was formally organized into 3 infantry regiments supported by artillery, reconnaissance, engineering, and medical units. Its total strength reached approximately 15,000 men. Equipment was largely standard German issue: Karabiner 98K rifles, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, mortars, and limited numbers of anti-tank guns. Armored support was minimal, reflecting the shortage of vehicles in the later stages of the war. Uniforms bore the Waffen-SS insignia, though a special sleeve patch depicting the Galician lion was introduced as a symbolic concession to national identity. The political context of the division's deployment was shaped by Germany's deteriorating position on the Eastern Front. Following defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army advanced into Ukraine in late 1943 and early 1944. German forces sought to stabilize their defenses along the Carpathians and the Vistula River. Galicia became a frontline region, and German commanders were eager to use the newly trained division in defensive operations. In April 1944, the division was declared ready for combat, despite limited training time and lack of battlefield experience. It was attached to the 15th Army Corps within Army Group North Ukraine. The first months of 1944 also witnessed growing partisan activity in western Ukraine. Soviet partisan detachments, as well as formations of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, a UPA, operated in the forests and countryside. This created a complex environment for the Galician Division, which was expected not only to face the Red Army, but also to secure rear areas. Relations between the division and the UPA were ambivalent. While both shared anti-Soviet objectives, the Waffen-SS chain of command prevented open cooperation. Instead, occasional clashes occurred, reflecting the fragmented political landscape. The division's baptism of fire came in July 1944 during the Soviet Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. The Red Army launched a massive assault with overwhelming numerical superiority. The 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, deployed over 800,000 men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, against approximately 400,000 German and Allied troops in the sector. The Galician Division was positioned near the town of Brody, forming part of the defensive line. For the volunteers, this was the decisive test of their training and resolve. As Soviet forces advanced, the Theudinian Army Corps, including the Galician Division, was encircled in what became known as the Brody Pocket. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, the division faced relentless attacks. Casualty rates were severe. Out of roughly 15,000 men, estimates suggest that only around 3,000 to 5,000 managed to break out of the encirclement and regroup. Thousands were killed or captured, with many prisoners facing execution or deportation to labor camps in the Soviet Union. The destruction of the division at Brody marked both its tragic initiation into combat and the end of its first formation. For the Germans, the loss highlighted the fragility of hastily created foreign divisions in the face of massive Soviet offensives. For the Ukrainian volunteers, the battle became a defining episode. Some viewed it as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds, while others criticized the Germans for using the division as expendable manpower. For the Soviets, the capture of division members provided a propaganda opportunity to denounce collaboration and emphasize the Red Army's dominance. In the wider context, the Battle of Brody underscored the shifting balance of power in Eastern Europe during the summer of 1944, as German defenses collapsed and the Red Army pressed towards Central Europe. After the destruction of the Galician Division in the Brody Pocket, only a fraction of its original strength survived. Approximately 3,000 to 5,000 men managed to escape encirclement and regroup, often in small detachments moving westward under fire. The survivors were collected and reorganized by the German command, which still sought to utilize them amid critical manpower shortages. By late summer 1944, the remnants of the division were withdrawn from the front and sent to Slovakia and later Austria for reformation and further training. This decision reflected both German desperation and the belief that the Ukrainian volunteers could still serve as a reliable force in defensive operations. The reorganization process involved recruiting additional personnel to replace losses. Many came from displaced persons, conscripts from occupied territories, or Ukrainians who had fled advancing Soviet forces. By autumn 1944, the division again reached an approximate strength of 12,000 men. The structure remained largely the same. 3 infantry regiments supported by artillery, reconnaissance, and service units. German officers still held command, but the presence of Ukrainian chaplains and cultural officers maintained the image of a national formation. The lion emblem continued to be worn on the uniform, though its symbolic meaning differed greatly depending on perspective. For some, it represented national pride. For others, collaboration. In September 1944, the division was redeployed to suppress the Slovak national uprising, which had broken out against German occupation. Alongside German units, the division took part in operations in the Carpathians and central Slovakia. Here, the volunteers were not engaged in large-scale battles against the Red Army, but rather in anti-partisan operations and rear-area security duties. This brought them into direct conflict with Slovak insurgents, partisans, and sometimes civilians, further complicating the division's reputation in post-war memory. For the German command, the unit proved useful in stabilizing the region, though questions of loyalty and effectiveness remained. As the war moved into its final phase, the Galician Division was transferred to Austria in early 1945 and restructured once more. It became part of the newly proclaimed Ukrainian National Army under General Pavlo Shandruk, an attempt to unite all Ukrainian formations under a single command. This late rebranding was more political than military. By this point, Germany was on the verge of collapse, and the initiative aimed to secure a future for Ukrainian units in negotiations with the Western Allies. For many of the volunteers, the hope was that presenting themselves as a Ukrainian army, rather than as a Waffen SS unit, might protect them from Soviet retribution and offer a chance to avoid forced repatriation. Meanwhile, the Soviet authorities pursued a harsh stance toward all former members of the division. Those captured at Brody, or later on the battlefield, were treated as traitors under Soviet law. Many were executed, sent to the Gulag, or deported to remote regions of the Soviet Union. Propaganda portrayed the division as evidence of Ukrainian collaboration with Nazi Germany, a narrative that would dominate Soviet historiography for decades. This contrasted with some Ukrainian diaspora communities in the West, where the division's veterans later presented their service as an anti-Soviet struggle rather than an endorsement of Nazi ideology. By the spring of 1945, the division found itself retreating alongside other German forces into Austria. With the collapse of the Third Reich imminent, its members faced a critical decision whether to surrender to the Red Army or attempt to reach British or American lines. The vast majority chose the latter, recognizing that falling into Soviet hands would almost certainly mean imprisonment or death. This final retreat brought them to the Austrian Alps, where they awaited the war's end and the uncertainty of post-war fate. Their survival now depended not on battlefield performance, but on the shifting policies of the victorious Allied powers. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the Galician Division, now reorganized within the framework of the Ukrainian National Army, the collapse of the Third Reich marked both the end of its military role and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. The surviving units, numbering approximately 8,000 to 9,000 men, withdrew into Austria and concentrated in the region of Styria. Their immediate concern was to avoid capture by the Red Army, which had advanced deep into Central Europe. Soviet policy toward captured members of the division was unambiguous. All were to be treated as traitors and subject to severe punishment, including execution or deportation to labor camps. Recognizing this danger, division leaders sought surrender to the Western Allies, specifically the British forces advancing from Italy into southern Austria. On May 10, 1945, the division officially capitulated to British troops near Rastatt. This act spared its members from Soviet custody, but their fate remained far from secure. The Yalta Agreement obligated the Allies to repatriate citizens of the Soviet Union, and Moscow demanded the handover of all individuals who had served in German uniform. The central question thus became whether the members of the Galician Division would be classified as Soviet citizens or as displaced persons of pre-1939 Polish citizenship. At this point, legal complexities played a crucial role. When the division was recruited in 1943, most of its volunteers had come from Galicia, which before the war had been part of the Second Polish Republic. In September 1939, the region was annexed by the Soviet Union, but Western governments had never formally recognized this annexation. Therefore, under British and American interpretation, these individuals were not Soviet citizens, but rather former Polish subjects. This distinction ultimately saved thousands of lives. Instead of being forcibly repatriated to the USSR, the majority of the division's soldiers were classified as prisoners of war under British custody. During 1945-1946, the men were interned in camps in Italy, notably at Rimini. Conditions in the camps were difficult, but not brutal compared to Soviet captivity. The prisoners were guarded, interrogated, and subject to political scrutiny. Soviet representatives repeatedly demanded their extradition, citing collaboration with the Waffen SS. However, British and American officials hesitated, influenced by both legal considerations and emerging geopolitical realities. The onset of the Cold War shifted Western priorities. Individuals with strong anti-Soviet credentials, including members of the division, were increasingly viewed as potential allies rather than enemies. By 1947, decisions were made to resettle the former soldiers rather than repatriate them. Many were allowed to emigrate to the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and other countries. In Britain, several thousand ex-members were employed in industries facing labor shortages, such as agriculture and mining. In Canada, where a large Ukrainian diaspora already existed, veterans were eventually admitted after a period of debate and investigation. The arrival of these men sparked controversies as critics questioned whether individuals who had served in a Waffen SS division should be admitted to Western societies. Nonetheless, the majority integrated into émigré communities and built new civilian lives. For the Soviet Union, the Western decision not to extradite the division's veterans was a source of bitter resentment. Soviet propaganda continued to depict the Galician Division as a symbol of betrayal and collaboration, using it to reinforce narratives of wartime treachery and the heroism of the Red Army. In contrast, within the Ukrainian diaspora, particularly in North America, veterans presented their service as part of a broader struggle for national independence. Memoirs, publications, and veterans associations framed the division not as an instrument of Nazism, but as an early attempt to form a Ukrainian military force in the 20th century. These contrasting interpretations would shape the post-war memory of the division for decades. In the West, former members became part of Ukrainian émigré political and cultural life, often emphasizing their anti-Soviet stance during the early Cold War. In the Soviet Union, however, the narrative was firmly negative. Veterans were condemned as fascist collaborators, and any attempt to discuss alternative perspectives was suppressed. This divergence between Soviet and émigré historiography laid the foundation for later debates about the meaning and legacy of the division, debates that remain contested into the present. Following the surrender and relocation of the Galician Division's members to camps in Italy and Austria, the post-war years became a period of transition and redefinition. The immediate challenge was survival. Thousands of former soldiers lived under Guard and Allied-controlled camps, uncertain whether they would be handed over to the Soviet Union or permitted to rebuild their lives in the West. Their situation reflected the broader displacement crisis in Europe, where millions of refugees, prisoners of war, and forced laborers sought resettlement after the destruction of the conflict. The men of the division, numbering between 8,000 and 9,000 by mid-1945, were initially concentrated in Rimini under British administration. In the camp, they were subject to interrogation by Allied authorities and regular visits by Soviet representatives demanding their repatriation. British and American officers investigated claims of war crimes, attempting to determine whether the division had been involved in atrocities. The findings were inconclusive. While some individual members had served in German auxiliary police units prior to their enlistment, the division itself had been largely deployed in conventional military operations against Soviet forces. This lack of definitive evidence contributed to the eventual decision not to extradite them en masse. In the camps, the prisoners organized themselves into cultural, religious, and educational activities. Chaplains held regular services, schools were established for younger men, and political discussions flourished. For many, the camp became a crucible for redefining their identity, not as Waffen SS members, but as Ukrainians in exile. Leaders such as Pavlo Shandruk, who had assumed command of the Ukrainian National Army in the final days of the war, played a significant role in lobbying for recognition of the soldiers as displaced persons rather than collaborators. These efforts were supported by segments of the Ukrainian diaspora, particularly in North America and Western Europe, who emphasized the anti-Soviet motivations of the volunteers. The decision to allow resettlement came gradually. By 1947, Britain accepted several thousand veterans for employment in industries facing labor shortages, particularly in agriculture and coal mining. Men were transported from Italy to camps in England and Scotland, and later integrated into rural communities. From 1948 onward, opportunities for emigration expanded. Canada admitted approximately 2,000 veterans after parliamentary debates and background checks, while Australia and other Commonwealth countries accepted smaller numbers. These resettlements transformed the division's members into long-term émigrés, often active in Ukrainian community organizations, churches, and publishing ventures. The political context of their resettlement was shaped by the emerging Cold War. Western governments, increasingly concerned with containing Soviet influence, became more tolerant of groups with strong anti-communist credentials. Former members of the division were often portrayed not as collaborators, but as refugees from totalitarianism. This shift in perception was controversial. Polish, Jewish, and Soviet organizations frequently protested against their admission to the West, arguing that Waffen SS veterans should not be legitimized. Yet the pressing need for labor, combined with the political utility of anti-Soviet émigrés, outweighed these objections. For the Soviet Union, the matter remained a grievance. Soviet propaganda frequently highlighted the division in literature, press, and films as an example of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism and betrayal. This narrative served both to delegitimize Ukrainian nationalist movements and to reinforce the Soviet Union's self-image as the sole victor over fascism in Eastern Europe. Within the USSR, discussion of alternative interpretations was strictly forbidden, and families of division veterans who remained in Soviet territory often faced suspicion and discrimination. In the diaspora, veterans sought to control their own narrative. Organizations such as the Brotherhood of Former Soldiers of the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army were established, publishing memoirs, commemorative albums, and historical studies. These works consistently emphasize the defensive and anti-Soviet nature of their service, distancing the division from the broader crimes of the Waffen SS. For many émigrés, participation in the division was presented as one episode in the longer struggle for Ukrainian independence, a struggle that would continue through political activism in exile. By the early 1950s, most of the surviving veterans had transitioned into civilian life in their new host countries. They became farmers, laborers, and professionals, integrating into local economies while maintaining strong ties to Ukrainian cultural institutions. Yet the memory of their wartime service remained controversial, shaping both their collective identity and the historical debates that would emerge in later decades. Their survival and dispersal across the West ensured that the Galician Division would not vanish into obscurity, but instead continue to occupy a contested place in the history of the Second World War and its aftermath. In the decades that followed the war, the fate of the Galician Division became a subject of memory, politics, and controversy. In Western Europe, North America, and Australia, veterans attempted to establish a stable presence within their new societies while preserving their shared identity. At the same time, Soviet authorities maintained a consistent campaign of denunciation, framing the division as proof of collaboration between Ukrainian nationalism and Nazi Germany. This duality shaped how the division was remembered and debated across different parts of the world. In Britain, Canada, and other host countries, former members of the division lived under scrutiny. Immigration officials conducted background checks, and at times parliamentary debates questioned the morality of admitting former Waffen SS personnel. In Canada, public discussion became especially intense in the 1950s and 1960s, as Jewish and Polish organizations raised concerns about the settlement of veterans. Nonetheless, the majority of these men integrated into civilian life without major incidents. Many became active in local Ukrainian churches, youth associations, and community organizations. Veterans associations played a significant role in maintaining cohesion, organizing annual gatherings, publishing newsletters, and commemorating fallen comrades. The veterans' narrative emphasized continuity with the Ukrainian struggle for independence rather than service to the Third Reich. They stressed that their enlistment had been motivated by opposition to Soviet rule, pointing to the deportations and executions that had taken place during the Soviet occupation of Galicia in 1939-1941. Publications produced by veterans groups often described their experience in terms of sacrifice, self-defense, and the hope of creating a national army. These accounts deliberately separated the division from the ideological foundations of the Waffen SS, portraying it as a distinct unit that happened to operate under German command. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the division was consistently presented in a negative light. Soviet historiography, public education, and media described the 14th SS Division as a formation of fascist henchmen responsible for crimes against civilians. Textbooks emphasized its role as evidence of Ukrainian collaboration with occupiers, fitting this narrative into the larger framework of the Great Patriotic War, in which the Red Army liberated the region from both German forces and their local allies. Memorials, films, and novels reinforce this image, ensuring that several generations of Soviet citizens came to associate the Galician Division with treason. The clash of narratives intensified during the Cold War. Western governments, now aligned against the Soviet Union, were less inclined to pursue the veterans for extradition or punishment. This provided space for them to publish memoirs and histories, contributing to a competing body of literature that contradicted Soviet accounts. The broader émigré Ukrainian community often supported these efforts, seeing them as part of the cultural battle against Moscow's domination of historical memory. This led to the creation of archival collections, veterans' journals, and commemorative albums that circulated widely within diaspora circles. At the same time, debates about the division never disappeared. Questions of war crimes and culpability remained unresolved. Independent historians pointed out that while the division had not been involved in the major atrocities of the early war years, some members had previously served in auxiliary police formations implicated in the Holocaust. The boundary between individual responsibility and collective history became blurred, fueling arguments on both sides. Some researchers concluded that the division as a combat unit functioned primarily in conventional military engagements, while others emphasized the continuity between the police background of certain recruits and broader patterns of violence in occupied Eastern Europe. By the 1960s and 1970s, the veterans had aged, and their communities became more focused on preserving memory for the next generation. Monuments were erected in émigré centers such as Canada and the United Kingdom, often in churchyards or community centers. These memorials typically commemorated the fallen as fighters for Ukraine's freedom, omitting references to the Waffen SS. Such acts of remembrance reinforced the veterans' interpretation, but they also provoked criticism from groups who saw them as attempts to whitewash collaboration. The conflicting narratives surrounding the division demonstrated the broader contest over Eastern European history in the post-war period. For émigrés, the division symbolized resistance to Soviet domination. For the USSR, it epitomized treachery and collaboration with Nazism. For Western governments, it was a sensitive issue, balanced between the moral ambiguities of wartime service and the political imperatives of the Cold War. These tensions would not disappear with the passing of time, but instead continue to shape historical debates and public controversies well into the late 20th century. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the Galician Division had moved from being an immediate post-war problem of displaced persons to a subject of ongoing historical and political dispute. Veterans, by then established in Britain, Canada, the United States, and Australia, were well integrated into their host societies. Many had achieved stable livelihoods, built families, and become active members of Ukrainian diaspora institutions. Yet the memory of their wartime service did not fade. It continued to provoke debates about culpability, legitimacy, and historical interpretation. In Canada, where several thousand former division members settled, the issue became particularly visible. Ukrainian émigré organizations defended the veterans' right to recognition and rejected accusations of complicity in war crimes. Their stance was based on two main arguments: that the division had functioned as a regular combat unit of the Waffen SS and had not been engaged in systematic atrocities, and that its creation was driven by anti-Soviet rather than pro-Nazi motivations. Publications, conferences, and commemorative events sought to reinforce this narrative. Monuments were erected in Canadian cities, often at Ukrainian churches or cultural centers, inscribed with dedications to the division as fighters for Ukraine's freedom. Critics, however, strongly challenged these interpretations. Jewish organizations, Polish émigré groups, and certain scholars highlighted the Waffen SS connection, pointing out that membership in the organization itself was linked to the larger system of Nazi warfare and ideology. They noted that although the division had primarily fought in conventional battles, some recruits had previously served in German auxiliary police units in 1941-1943, which were directly involved in the Holocaust in Ukraine and Poland. The question of continuity between those earlier roles and the later formation of the division remained a major source of controversy. The debate intensified in the 1980s when the Canadian government established the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, commonly known as the Deschênes Commission, 1985-1987. Its purpose was to investigate allegations that Nazi war criminals had entered Canada after the war. The Galician Division was a major focus of these inquiries. Testimonies, archival records, and intelligence files were reviewed in detail. The final report concluded that membership in the division in itself was not sufficient evidence of war criminality. While it acknowledged that some individuals might have been implicated in earlier atrocities before joining the division, no collective guilt was assigned to the formation as a whole. The findings of the Deschênes Commission were controversial. Veterans associations welcomed the decision as a vindication of their long-standing position. They argued that the report demonstrated that the division had been unfairly maligned by Soviet propaganda and its allies. Critics, however, accused the Commission of whitewashing, pointing out that access to certain Soviet archives had been limited, and that the investigation had been constrained by Cold War political considerations. The controversy surrounding the report ensured that the division's history remained a contested issue in Canadian public life for years to come. In the Soviet Union, the narrative remained unchanged. Official publications continued to describe the division as a fascist unit guilty of crimes against civilians. Documentaries, films, and novels depicted its members as traitors, using their story to reinforce broader ideological lessons about the unity of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. The division was often cited in campaigns against bourgeois nationalism and in propaganda directed at Ukrainian dissident movements of the 1970s. Any attempt to question this interpretation within the Soviet academic framework was swiftly suppressed. Among Western scholars, interest in the division grew in the context of a wider re-examination of collaboration and resistance in occupied Europe. Historians debated whether the Galician Division should be seen primarily as a product of Nazi recruitment policies, as an expression of Ukrainian nationalism under occupation, or as an ambiguous formation that embodied both. Research in the 1980s and early 1990s often highlighted the difficulty of separating military history from political memory. Access to archives was still limited, but émigré sources provided insight into the internal life of the division, while testimonies from Soviet sources offered a different perspective. By the end of the Cold War, the Galician Division had become more than a historical subject. It was a touchstone in the politics of memory. For émigrés, it remained a symbol of sacrifice and a link to the broader struggle for Ukrainian independence. For Soviet and post-Soviet authorities, it represented treason and collaboration. For Western governments and historians, it posed a dilemma about justice, evidence, and the boundaries of accountability. The veterans themselves, now elderly, continued to gather at reunions, publish memoirs, and defend their record, even as the world around them was preparing for a new geopolitical transformation that would once again change how their past was understood. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 fundamentally altered the framework within which the history of the Galician Division was interpreted. For the first time in decades, independent Ukraine provided a political and cultural space where alternative perspectives could be expressed publicly without fear of repression. The veterans' narrative, long confined to émigré communities abroad, now entered Ukraine's domestic discourse. This development sparked new debates, both within the country and internationally, about the meaning and legacy of the division. In Western Ukraine, particularly in Galicia, some segments of society began to commemorate the division as part of a broader re-evaluation of nationalist movements suppressed during Soviet rule. Local organizations arranged memorial services for fallen soldiers, and monuments were erected in villages and towns where veterans or their families lived. Historical conferences were organized by regional institutes, often featuring contributions from former division members or their descendants. For many, the division was portrayed not as a Nazi formation, but as a symbol of the Ukrainian struggle against Soviet domination. This reinterpretation aligned with broader efforts to reclaim the memory of organizations such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which had also been vilified in Soviet historiography. At the national level, however, the issue remained sensitive. Successive Ukrainian governments in the 1990s and 2000s sought to balance competing demands: the desire in parts of Western Ukraine to honor the memory of anti-Soviet fighters, and the need to maintain good diplomatic relations with Russia, Poland, and Jewish organizations. Official recognition of the Galician Division was limited, and discussions often remained within academic or regional frameworks rather than state-level commemoration. The central government generally avoided making definitive statements, preferring a policy of cautious ambiguity. Internationally, the renewed public memory of the division triggered criticism and concern. In Poland, where memories of wartime atrocities and ethnic conflict between Poles and Ukrainians remained strong, public commemoration of the division was often met with protest. Jewish organizations likewise objected to efforts that appeared to rehabilitate or glorify a Waffen SS unit, emphasizing the moral and historical implications of its association with Nazi Germany. Russian state media and political figures also seized upon the issue, framing the commemoration of the division as evidence of alleged neo-fascism in Ukraine. These accusations were amplified in the context of post-Soviet geopolitical rivalry, with memory politics becoming a tool of international confrontation. Within academia, the opening of archives in Ukraine, Poland, and Russia provided new opportunities for research. Historians gained access to German military records, Soviet interrogation files, and émigré publications. The new evidence confirmed certain elements already known, that the division had been primarily engaged in conventional combat against the Red Army, particularly at Brody, and had not been centrally implicated in the Holocaust. However, documentation also highlighted the complex backgrounds of individual soldiers, some of whom had earlier served in auxiliary police units connected to atrocities. This reinforced the view that while the division as a whole was not directly a perpetrator of genocide, the personal trajectories of its members intersected with the broader machinery of occupation and violence. Public debates in Ukraine reflected these nuances only partially. In popular memory, the division became part of the larger narrative of resistance to Soviet rule. For younger generations in Western Ukraine, it often symbolized a lost opportunity for national self-defense and a precursor to the eventual independence of 1991. At the same time, critics within Ukraine, including scholars, politicians, and citizens from the east and south of the country, warned against romanticization and stressed the risks of ignoring the wider context of Nazi collaboration. These internal disagreements underscored the regional diversity of memory within Ukraine and highlighted the ongoing difficulty of creating a unified national narrative about the Second World War. The diaspora continued to play a role in shaping perception. Veterans associations abroad, by now aging and diminishing in number, collaborated with Ukrainian institutions to transfer their archives, memoirs, and monuments to the homeland. This process was framed as a return of memory, ensuring that the experiences of those who had once been scattered across Britain, Canada, and Australia would not be lost after their passing. The material they preserved contributed to the establishment of specialized research centers and museums in Lviv and other cities. By the early 2000s, the history of the Galician Division had become embedded in a larger struggle over historical interpretation in post-Soviet space. In Ukraine, it was increasingly seen by some as part of the heritage of the independence movement. In Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, it remained a symbol of collaboration. In the West, it continued to evoke controversy, particularly whenever veterans' parades or commemorative events appeared in the media. The collapse of the Soviet Union had not resolved the debates. It had simply relocated them into new arenas where memory, identity, and politics converged. In the 21st century, the legacy of the Galician Division became more deeply entangled in questions of memory politics, identity, and international relations. With Ukraine pursuing independence and integration into European institutions, the ways in which wartime history was remembered gained renewed importance. The division, as one of the most controversial formations associated with Ukrainians in the Second World War, stood at the center of these debates. Within Ukraine itself, discussion of the division reflected sharp regional differences. In Galicia and other parts of western Ukraine, commemorations of veterans and local memorials became relatively common, often organized by community groups, historians, or descendants of the soldiers. Religious ceremonies marked anniversaries of the Battle of Brody, and monuments and cemeteries bore inscriptions to the fallen as defenders of their homeland. For many in these regions, the division was folded into a broader narrative that celebrated the Ukrainian insurgent army and nationalist resistance movements as predecessors of the independent state established in 1991. In other regions of Ukraine, particularly in the east and south, the memory of the division was far more contested. Soviet narratives had taken root more firmly there, and the idea of honoring a Waffen SS unit provoked discomfort or outright opposition. Political debates in parliament occasionally touched on the issue, with some parties advocating recognition of the division as part of Ukraine's struggle for independence, while others condemned it as a dangerous revision of history. This divergence reflected not only historical memory, but also the broader political divide within Ukraine between orientations toward Europe and toward Russia. Internationally, the division remained a sensitive subject. In Poland, the legacy of wartime ethnic violence, particularly the massacres of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia, carried out by Ukrainian nationalist forces, often became linked in public discourse with the Galician Division, despite their distinct origins and structures. Polish officials and scholars criticized Ukrainian commemorations, viewing them as attempts to minimize or obscure collaboration with Nazi Germany. Relations between Poland and Ukraine periodically experienced tension over these historical disputes, even as both countries cooperated strategically in the face of broader regional challenges. Jewish organizations worldwide continued to monitor commemorative practices involving the division. Whenever veterans marched in parades or monuments were unveiled in Ukraine or abroad, protests often followed. These organizations emphasized the moral impossibility of separating a Waffen SS unit from the crimes of the Nazi regime, regardless of the specific combat record of the division itself. The Holocaust dimension remained a central point in these debates, as historical research confirmed that while the division had not been created to participate in genocide, some of its individual recruits had earlier served in auxiliary units connected to atrocities. Russia, meanwhile, made the memory of the division a tool of political propaganda. State media frequently portrayed any positive mention of the division in Ukraine as evidence of neo-Nazism or fascist rehabilitation. This narrative was used to delegitimize Ukraine's post-Soviet independence and to frame its Western orientation as morally suspect. During times of heightened conflict, particularly after 2014, the Galician Division reappeared in Russian official discourse as a symbol of alleged continuity between wartime collaboration and contemporary Ukrainian nationalism. This framing resonated with Soviet-era narratives, ensuring continuity in Russia's political use of history. Western academic research in the 21st century grew more nuanced as access to archives expanded, and as historians worked across national boundaries. Studies emphasize the complexity of the division's origins. German recruitment strategies, Ukrainian political aspirations, and the wider context of total war all intersected in its formation. Scholars highlighted that while the division was primarily engaged in conventional combat operations, its existence within the Waffen SS meant that it could not be disentangled from the ideological and structural framework of the Nazi state. This position resisted both outright condemnation and full rehabilitation, stressing ambiguity and the moral dilemmas faced by individuals caught in wartime upheaval. Veterans themselves, by the early 2000s, were reaching the final years of their lives. Their associations in Canada, Britain, and elsewhere held commemorative events, published memoirs, and transferred archival materials to universities and research institutes. The goal was to secure their interpretation of history before the generation passed away. Younger members of the Ukrainian diaspora often continued this work, framing the division as part of the broader history of national struggle. At the same time, controversies surrounding monuments and memorials grew sharper. In Canada, for example, monuments honoring the division became the focus of debates in local communities, especially when questions arose about whether public funds should support their maintenance. In Ukraine, similar disputes occurred whenever new memorials were proposed, with opponents stressing the dangers of honoring a Waffen SS unit and supporters emphasizing the anti-Soviet context of its creation. These disputes revealed how memory of the division had moved beyond the veterans themselves, becoming a symbolic battleground in wider conflicts about history, identity, and political legitimacy. By the second decade of the 21st century, the legacy of the Galician Division had become less about the wartime unit itself, and more about what it represented to different groups. For some Ukrainians, it symbolized a tragic but meaningful attempt at armed self-defense in the absence of statehood. For others, both inside and outside Ukraine, it remained inseparably tied to the crimes of the Nazi regime. For Russia, it served as a political weapon. And for scholars, it was a case study in the complexity of wartime collaboration, nationalism, and memory. These overlapping perspectives ensured that the division's history continued to echo long after the last veterans had laid down their arms. By the time the last veterans of the Galician Division were reaching the end of their lives, the historical and political weight of their service had outgrown the actual events of 1943-1945. The division had become a prism through which questions of collaboration, nationalism, resistance, and identity were debated. Its military role, centered on its formation, training, and destruction at Brody, was comparatively limited in the broader scope of the Second World War. Yet its symbolic significance, both during and after the conflict, far exceeded its battlefield achievements. The long-term impact of the division can be understood on several levels. Militarily, it was one of many foreign volunteer units integrated into the Waffen SS as Germany faced mounting manpower shortages. Its combat record was short and largely defined by defensive operations in 1944, culminating in near destruction in the Brody Pocket. Strategically, it had little influence on the outcome of the war, serving more as a reflection of Germany's desperate need for reinforcements than as a decisive fighting force. For Ukrainian history, however, its existence highlighted the deep dilemmas faced by a stateless nation caught between two totalitarian powers. Politically, the division's story became a battleground of narratives. In the Soviet Union, it was portrayed as treachery and collaboration, a useful tool to delegitimize Ukrainian nationalist aspirations. In the Ukrainian diaspora, it was reframed as an early attempt at national military organization, a claim reinforced by veterans' memoirs, publications, and commemorations. In the West, governments oscillated between suspicion and pragmatism, balancing legal and moral concerns with the geopolitical realities of the Cold War. These competing interpretations ensured that the division's history remained unresolved, with meaning shifting depending on the observer's perspective. Socially, the veterans themselves played a central role in shaping post-war Ukrainian émigré life. Their organizations, cultural activities, and publications preserved a sense of continuity and purpose. Many became leaders in community institutions, ensuring that their experiences informed broader narratives of exile and national struggle. Yet their integration into Western societies also raised uncomfortable questions. Should men who had served in a Waffen SS division be accepted as ordinary immigrants, or should their pasts forever define them? The compromises reached, resettlement without collective prosecution, reflected the complexity of justice in the aftermath of global war. Historically, the division occupies a contested place. Scholars highlight the need to distinguish between the unit's collective role and the individual trajectories of its members. While the division as such was not created for genocidal purposes, its embedding within the Waffen SS ties it to the ideological and institutional framework of the Nazi state. Individual soldiers, some of whom had prior service in police units, complicate the picture further. The historical record thus resists both outright condemnation and simplistic rehabilitation, instead demanding acknowledgement of ambiguity, coercion, and choice under extreme circumstances. In contemporary Ukraine, the memory of the division continues to shape debates over national history. For some, it represents a tragic but significant attempt to assert Ukrainian identity in the absence of statehood. For others, it is a reminder of the dangers of aligning with an occupying power. Regional divides, political pressures, and external influences, particularly from Russia and Poland, ensure that consensus remains elusive. The legacy of the division thus reflects broader challenges in reconciling different layers of wartime experience within a coherent national narrative. Internationally, the division remains a point of contention whenever its history is invoked. Russian political discourse routinely cites it as evidence of alleged fascism in modern Ukraine. Polish memory politics continues to link it, directly or indirectly, with the broader history of Polish-Ukrainian conflict. In Western academic circles, it remains a subject of careful study, used as a case to explore the complexities of occupation, collaboration, and nationalism in 20th century Europe. Ultimately, the story of the Galician Division is less about its military record than about the historical questions it raises. How should nations remember groups that fought under the command of a regime responsible for immense crimes, yet did so out of their own political or national motivations? Where does one draw the line between collaboration and self-defense? And how can the experiences of individuals, caught between ideologies, empires, and survival, be represented fairly in historical memory? The answers remain contested. For the veterans, their service was a chapter in a long struggle for independence. For their opponents, it was proof of complicity in fascism. For historians, it is a case study in the moral and political dilemmas of a continent at war. As time passes and direct witnesses are gone, the division endures not as a military unit, but as a symbol, a reminder of the unresolved tensions of the Second World War, the Cold War, and the politics of memory that continue to shape Europe today.